Walter Brennan stood in the doorway of his shop and watched the convoy roll down Main Street. 15 trucks. 15 rigs he had pulled back from the dead 3 weeks ago during the worst blizzard Cedar Falls had seen in 40 years. He had nearly killed himself doing it, 2 straight nights in freezing temperatures, every last dollar spent on parts, heating oil he could not afford to replace. Now they were back. All 15. And what they carried in their trailers was something Walter never could have imagined. The old mechanic grabbed the doorframe. His knees buckled. Because for the first time in 43 years of giving everything to everyone, someone had finally given something back. The morning wind cut through Cedar Falls like a blade dragged across bare skin. It swept down from the Bighorn Mountains, carrying the kind of cold that made bones ache and old injuries whisper reminders of every hard year that had come before. Walter Brennan felt it in his left knee first, the one he had twisted under a Peterbilt transmission back in 1994, and then in the knuckles of both hands, swollen and stiff, from decades of turning wrenches in temperatures that would send most men running for a fireplace. He stood at the entrance of Brennan's Auto and Diesel, the small repair shop he had built with his own hands 43 years ago, back when Cedar Falls still had a functioning downtown and the Interstate 80 corridor brought enough traffic to keep a mechanic fed. The building was not much to look at. Corrugated metal siding faded to a dull silver. A hand-painted sign above the bay doors that his wife Dorothy had lettered herself in the summer of 1981, the yellow paint now cracked and peeling, but still legible. 2 service bays, a waiting area with a coffee machine that had not made a decent cup since the Clinton administration, and a small office in the back where Walter kept his books in a leather ledger because he had never trusted computers with numbers that mattered. At 68 years old, Walter Brennan was the kind of man that small towns used to produce in abundance. 6 feet tall, though he had lost an inch to time and gravity. Shoulders still broad from a lifetime of physical labor. Hands the size of dinner plates, scarred and darkened permanently by engine oil that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. His face was weathered like the Wyoming landscape itself, deep lines carved by wind and sun, and the quiet kind of grief that never fully leaves. Dorothy had been gone for 11 years now. Pancreatic cancer, 8 months from diagnosis to funeral. Walter had closed the shop for exactly 3 days. The day she died, the day of the funeral, and 1 day after, which he spent sitting in her garden, staring at the rose bushes she had planted the year they got married. On the 4th day, he opened the bay doors at 6 in the morning, same as always, because that is what Dorothy would have told him to do. They had never had children. It was the one sadness that sat between them like an empty chair at every holiday table, though they rarely spoke of it aloud. Dorothy had channeled that unspent love into the community, organizing fundraisers for the volunteer fire department, tutoring kids at the elementary school, baking pies for every family that suffered a loss or celebrated a birth. Walter had channeled it into his work. Every truck driver who pulled into his shop with a broken axle or a seized engine or a transmission that sounded like a bag of hammers received the same treatment: honest diagnosis, fair price, and work done right the first time. But it was what Walter did beyond the invoices that defined him. The truckers who ran the I-80 corridor between Cheyenne and Rock Springs knew about the old mechanic in Cedar Falls, the way they knew about reliable truck stops and dangerous stretches of highway, through word of mouth passed from driver to driver like a survival guide. If you broke down within 50 miles of Cedar Falls and could not afford the repair, Walter Brennan would fix your rig anyway. He would not make a show of it. He would not announce it. He would simply hand you the keys and say the same thing he always said: "You can settle up next time you come through." Most never came back to pay. Walter never chased the money. Over 43 years, the uncollected debts had accumulated into a staggering sum that Walter kept tallied in the back pages of his ledger. Not because he intended to collect, but because Dorothy had once told him that keeping records was the responsible thing to do. The number had crossed $200,000 years ago. He had stopped updating it after she died. Now, on this particular November morning, with the wind howling and the sky turning the color of wet concrete, Walter was facing a different kind of number. The property tax bill that had arrived yesterday sat on his desk like a verdict. $6,400, due in 90 days. The shop had brought in just under $14,000 in the last 12 months, barely enough to cover utilities, parts inventory, and the modest groceries that sustained a man who had learned to live on very little. The tax bill might as well have been $600,000. He did not have it. He would not have it in 90 days. And for the first time in 43 years, Walter Brennan looked at the walls of his shop and calculated how many months he had left before the county took it from him. He poured himself a cup of the terrible coffee, took a sip, and turned on the weather radio mounted above the workbench. The National Weather Service out of Riverton was issuing a winter storm warning. A massive system was building over the Rockies, the kind of storm that shut down highways and buried small towns for days. Winds up to 60 miles per hour. Temperatures dropping to 20 below. 18 to 24 inches of snow expected across the I-80 corridor. Walter looked out the window at the sky and shook his head slowly. He had lived through enough Wyoming winters to read the weather without a radio. The air had that weight to it, heavy and still, the way it always got before something terrible arrived. The last trucks heading west on I-80 were pushing hard, trying to outrun what was coming. Some of them would make it. Some would not. He walked to the back of the shop and checked his inventory. He had enough heating oil for maybe 4 days. A modest stock of common parts, belts, hoses, filters, a few alternators. His emergency generator was old but functional, and in the small kitchen behind his office, he had enough canned soup and coffee to feed himself for a week. Walter Brennan did not know it yet, but he was about to feed a lot more than himself. The storm arrived at 4:17 in the afternoon, and it arrived angry. It did not build gradually the way some winter systems did, with polite warnings of light flurries before the heavy snow. This one came down like a curtain dropping on a stage. One moment the highway was visible from Walter's shop window, and the next it was gone, swallowed by a wall of white so dense it seemed solid. The wind hit the metal siding of the shop with a sound like a freight train coupling, and the temperature plummeted 15 degrees in under an hour. Walter had been replacing a water pump on a Ford F-250 belonging to Ray Colton, a rancher from outside town. He stopped working and walked to the bay doors. Through the gaps in the metal, he could hear something beneath the wind. The deep guttural protest of diesel engines straining against conditions no truck was designed to handle. The first one appeared at 5:40, a Kenworth W900 with Michigan plates, its headlights cutting weakly through the blizzard like candles in a hurricane. The driver, a heavy-set man named Phil Duncan, who had been hauling refrigerated produce from Grand Rapids to Sacramento, had lost traction on the ice that formed beneath the fresh snow and had slid his rig into the shallow ditch along the exit ramp. He was not injured, but his truck was going nowhere without help. Walter pulled on his heaviest coat, grabbed a tow chain, and walked out into the storm. By 8 o'clock that evening, there were 7 trucks in various states of distress within a mile of his shop. By midnight, there were 15. The Wyoming Highway Patrol had closed I-80 in both directions between Rawlins and Rock Springs, and every trucker who had been caught in the corridor was now stranded with nowhere to go. The truck stops in Rawlins were already full. The motels had stopped answering their phones, and Cedar Falls, population 412, had exactly one business still open and one man still willing to stand in 20 below temperatures with a wrench in his frozen hands. Walter worked through that first night without stopping. He pulled Phil Duncan's Kenworth out of the ditch using his own truck and the tow chain. He jump-started 3 rigs whose batteries had died in the cold. He replaced a serpentine belt on a Freightliner Cascadia driven by a young woman named Margaret Holloway, a single mother from Cheyenne who hauled lumber for a regional company and had never been caught in a storm this bad. Her hands were shaking when she climbed down from the cab, and Walter noticed she was wearing a jacket that was not nearly warm enough for Wyoming in November. "Come inside," he told her. "I have coffee. It is not good coffee, but it is hot." Margaret followed him into the shop and sat on the old bench in the waiting area, wrapping her hands around the chipped ceramic mug Walter handed her. She watched him move between the service bays and the parking area outside, methodically assessing each truck, making notes on a clipboard, prioritizing repairs based on severity. He did not rush. He did not panic. He worked with the calm efficiency of a man who had been solving problems his entire life and saw no reason to stop now. By 2 in the morning, the other truckers had gathered in Walter's shop. 15 drivers, most of them men, ranging in age from 24 to 61. They sat on toolboxes and overturned buckets and the concrete floor, drinking Walter's terrible coffee and eating the canned soup he heated on a portable propane stove because the power had gone out at 11:30. The emergency generator kept the lights on in the main bay, but Walter rationed its use carefully. He did not know how long the storm would last or how much fuel he could afford to burn. Margaret Holloway watched Walter move among the drivers, checking on each one, asking if they needed anything, offering blankets he pulled from a closet in the back that seemed to contain an entire emergency preparedness kit assembled over decades. She noticed something that the other drivers, wrapped up in their own discomfort and anxiety, did not. Walter was limping, his left knee was clearly causing him pain, and every few minutes he would pause, press his hand against his lower back, close his eyes for just a moment, and then continue as if nothing had happened. "You should sit down," Margaret told him when he passed by her bench. Walter looked at her with an expression that suggested the idea had genuinely not occurred to him. "There are still 3 trucks I have not looked at," he said, as though that were a complete explanation. "They can wait until morning. The drivers cannot. 2 of them do not have sleeper cabs. They will freeze if I do not get their heaters running." He walked back out into the storm. Margaret watched him go and felt something she had not felt in a long time, the particular ache of watching someone give more than they had to give. The second night was worse than the first. The temperature dropped to 27 below zero. The wind chill made it feel like 40 below. Walter's heating oil ran out at 3 in the morning, and he switched to the propane heaters he kept for emergencies, knowing they would not last more than 12 hours. He called Ed Patterson, the owner of the only hardware store in Cedar Falls, and asked if he had any heating oil or propane to spare. Ed brought over 2 propane tanks from his personal supply and refused to take money for them. But when Ed left, Walter looked at the 15 trucks, the 15 drivers, and the dwindling supplies in his shop, and did what he always did when the math did not work out. He reached into the metal box under his desk, where he kept his personal savings, the money he had been slowly accumulating to pay the property tax bill, and counted out $800. He drove his old Chevy pickup through the storm to the gas station on the edge of town and bought every gallon of diesel and propane they had in stock. When he got back, Margaret was standing by the bay doors, waiting. "Where did you go?" she asked. "Fuel run," Walter said, unloading the propane tanks. "How much did that cost you?" Walter did not answer. He carried the tanks inside, hooked one up to the heater, and the shop filled with warmth again. The truckers, who had been huddled together for body heat, slowly relaxed. A few of them thanked Walter. Most of them did not, because most people do not think to thank the floor for being solid beneath their feet. Margaret thought about it, though. She thought about it a great deal. The storm lasted 4 days. 4 days of relentless wind and snow that buried Cedar Falls under nearly 3 feet of white. 4 days of Walter Brennan working 18-hour shifts in his shop, repairing trucks, rationing food, keeping 15 strangers alive and warm in a building that was never designed to be a shelter. By the 3rd day, he had gone through all his canned soup, all his coffee, and most of the food that neighbors brought over when they heard what was happening at the shop. Clara Mitchell, who ran the diner on Main Street, cooked 40 pounds of chili in her restaurant kitchen and had her husband Tom drive it over in their 4-wheel drive Suburban. The Methodist Church sent blankets and pillows. Ed Patterson came back with more propane and a case of bottled water. Cedar Falls took care of its own. That had always been true. But Walter was the one who had started it. Walter was the one standing in the cold at 3 in the morning, his arthritic hands buried in the engine compartment of a stranger's truck, because the alternative, letting someone suffer when he had the skill to help, was simply not something his conscience would permit. Margaret Holloway stayed close to Walter during those 4 days, not because she needed his help, her Freightliner was running fine after the belt replacement, but because she recognized something in him that she understood intimately, the compulsion to give until there was nothing left. She had seen it in her own mother, a woman who had worked 3 jobs to keep Margaret and her 2 brothers fed after their father left, and who had died at 54 of a heart attack that the doctors said was caused by stress and exhaustion, but that Margaret knew was caused by a lifetime of putting everyone else first. On the 3rd night, when the other truckers were sleeping in their cabs or on the floor of the waiting area, Margaret found Walter sitting in his office, staring at a piece of paper. She knocked on the open door. "You should be sleeping," she said. "So should you." She sat down across from him. The desk between them was cluttered with invoices, parts catalogues, and a leather ledger that looked like it had been in use since the shop opened. The piece of paper Walter had been staring at was a property tax bill. "How bad is it?" Margaret asked, because she was not the kind of person who pretended not to see what was right in front of her. Walter folded the bill and slid it under the ledger. "Nothing I cannot handle. That is what my mother used to say, about everything, right up until the end." Walter looked at her. In the dim light of the office, with the generator humming in the background and the wind screaming outside, he looked every one of his 68 years. The lines in his face seemed deeper. The skin under his eyes was dark with exhaustion. His hands, resting on the desk, trembled slightly, whether from cold, fatigue, or something else, Margaret could not tell. "Your mother sounds like she was a good woman," Walter said. "She was. She gave everything she had to everyone around her, and when she died, she had nothing left. Not even her health." Margaret paused. "Sound familiar?" Walter was quiet for a long time. The wind filled the silence between them with its low, mournful howl. "Dorothy, my wife, she used to say the same thing. She would tell me I was going to work myself into the ground, that I needed to learn the difference between being generous and being foolish." He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that carried more sadness than joy. "I told her I would figure it out eventually." "Did you?" "She died before I got the chance to answer." Margaret felt the weight of that sentence settle in her chest. She understood now what she was looking at. Not just a generous man, but a man who had been running from his own grief for 11 years by filling every empty moment with work, with service, with the needs of strangers, because stopping meant sitting in a quiet house surrounded by Dorothy's things, and that was a pain he could not fix with a wrench. The next morning, the storm began to break. By noon on the fourth day, the sky cleared to that impossible Wyoming blue, deep and vast, and so bright it hurt to look at. The highway patrol began reopening I-80 in stages. The plows came through Cedar Falls, pushing walls of snow to the sides of Main Street. And one by one, the 15 truckers started their engines, checked their mirrors, and pulled out of Walter Brennan's parking lot. Each one stopped to shake Walter's hand or clap him on the shoulder. A few tried to pay him. Walter refused every offer. "You can settle up next time you come through," he said to each of them, the same words he had been saying for 43 years. Phil Duncan, the first trucker who had arrived, pressed a $100 bill into Walter's palm. "Take it," he said. "You earned 10 times that." Walter tried to give it back, but Phil was already climbing into his cab. The Kenworth's engine roared to life, and Phil Duncan pulled onto the highway heading west, flashing his lights twice in farewell. Margaret Holloway was the last to leave. She stood by her Freightliner, her boots crunching in the packed snow, and looked at Walter with an expression he could not quite read. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." "It was nothing. It was not nothing." She held his gaze. "I want you to know that." She climbed into her cab, and Walter watched her Freightliner merge onto I-80, the big truck growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the glare of sunlight on snow. Then the parking lot was empty. The shop was quiet, and Walter Brennan was alone again, standing in the cold with $800 fewer in his savings, a tax bill he could not pay, and the familiar silence of a life built entirely around the needs of others. He went inside, poured himself the last cup of terrible coffee, and sat in Dorothy's chair. The old recliner he had moved from the house to the office after she died because it still smelled faintly of her perfume. He closed his eyes. His knee throbbed. His back ached. His hands were so stiff he could barely close them into fists. And for the first time in a very long time, Walter Brennan allowed himself to feel something he had spent 43 years refusing to acknowledge. He was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, the kind of tired that settled into the marrow of your bones and whispered that maybe you had given enough. Maybe it was time to stop. 3 weeks passed. The storm became a memory, replaced by the dry, bitter cold of a Wyoming December. Walter went back to his routine, opening the shop at 6, closing at 6, fixing whatever came through the doors, eating dinner alone in his kitchen, falling asleep in front of the television. The tax bill sat on his desk like a countdown clock. He had 67 days left. He had managed to save $412 since the storm, which meant he was roughly $6,000 short of keeping his shop, his home, and the only life he had ever known. He had considered selling the shop. The thought made him physically ill, not because of the money. The building and the land were worth maybe $150,000 on a good day, in a market that had not been good in years, but because selling the shop meant erasing the last physical evidence that Walter and Dorothy Brennan had existed in this world. The sign she had painted, the workbench he had built, the coffee machine that had outlasted everything except the stubbornness of the man who refused to replace it. Selling the shop was not a financial transaction, it was an erasure. On a Tuesday morning in mid-December, Walter was underneath a Dodge Ram replacing an oil pan gasket when he heard something that made him roll out from under the truck and stand up. It was a sound he knew well, the deep, rumbling chorus of multiple diesel engines approaching in formation. He walked to the bay door and looked east down Main Street. A truck was coming. Then another. Then another. Walter stepped outside into the cold and watched as truck after truck turned off I-80 and rolled down the exit ramp into Cedar Falls. Kenworths, Peterbilts, Freightliners, Macs. They came in a line, one after another, their running lights bright in the grey December morning, their air horns sounding in short rhythmic blasts that echoed off the mountains. He counted them as they came. 5, 8, 12, 15 trucks. The same 15 trucks he had kept alive during the storm. They pulled into the parking lot of Brennan's Auto and Diesel, which was nowhere near large enough to hold 15 semi-trucks, so they lined up along Main Street, their engines idling in a rumbling chorus that brought people out of the diner, the hardware store, the post office, and every house within earshot. Clara Mitchell stood in the doorway of her restaurant with her hand over her mouth. Ed Patterson came out of his store and stood on the sidewalk, staring. The first cab door opened and Phil Duncan climbed down. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt and a grin so wide it looked like it might not fit on his face. He walked straight to Walter, who was standing in the entrance of his shop with an expression of total bewilderment. "What is this?" Walter asked. "This," Phil said, "is what happens when you spend 43 years being the best man nobody ever heard of." The other drivers were climbing out of their cabs now. Walter recognized each of them. The young kid from Nebraska who had been hauling grain. The older couple from Montana who drove as a team. The quiet man from Ohio whose refrigeration unit Walter had rewired at 2 in the morning. And there, stepping down from her Freightliner at the end of the line, was Margaret Holloway. She walked toward Walter with a calm, measured stride, and in her hand she carried a clipboard. "Margaret," Walter said, "what did you do?" What someone should have done a long time ago. She turned to face the line of trucks. "Open them up." One by one, the drivers walked to the backs of their trailers and rolled up the doors. Walter Brennan had spent his life looking at the insides of engines. He understood mechanical things. He understood torque and compression and the precise relationship between fuel and air that made combustion possible. But he did not understand what he was seeing now, because what he was seeing did not operate according to any mechanical principle he had ever learned. The trailers were full, every single one. Phil Duncan's trailer held a complete set of professional-grade shop equipment, a hydraulic lift, a tire balancer, an engine hoist, an air compressor, and diagnostic tools that Walter had only ever seen in magazine advertisements. The equipment was brand new, still in factory packaging, with a total value that Walter could not begin to calculate. The young driver from Nebraska had brought building materials, lumber, roofing panels, insulation, and enough paint to cover every surface of the shop twice over. The team from Montana carried a commercial-grade heating system, a modern, efficient unit that would replace the ancient propane setup Walter had been nursing along for years. Another trailer held a new sign. Professionally designed and manufactured, it read Brennan's Auto and Diesel, SI 1981, in clean, bold lettering, with a smaller line beneath that said, "Founded by Walter and Dorothy Brennan." Margaret had remembered the name. She had remembered the old sign above the bay doors and the woman who had painted it. Walter stared at the sign for a long time. His jaw worked, but no words came out. Margaret stepped beside him and opened the clipboard. "3 weeks ago, after I left your shop, I called Phil. Phil called Eddie. Eddie called Louise and Frank. We started a fund, reached out to every trucker who ever passed through Cedar Falls and got helped by a mechanic who never charged them what he should have. She paused. You would be amazed how many people remember you, Walter. I do not understand, Walter said, and his voice was not steady. Yes, you do. Margaret turned to face him. You spent 43 years giving everything you had to people who needed it. You never asked for anything back. You never complained. You never stopped. And 3 weeks ago, you spent your last $800 keeping 15 strangers warm during a blizzard. She held up the clipboard. This is what that looks like when it comes back to you. The clipboard held a printout from a bank account, a fund established in Walter Brennan's name. The balance read $47,322. Contributions had come from over 200 people, truckers, former customers, people Walter had helped over 4 decades who had never forgotten the old mechanic in Cedar Falls who fixed their trucks and never asked for payment. Walter's knees buckled slightly, and Phil Duncan was there to steady him. Easy, old man, Phil said. We did not drive all the way back here to watch you fall over. Walter looked at Phil, then at Margaret, then at the line of trucks stretching down Main Street, their trailers open like gifts waiting to be unwrapped. The people of Cedar Falls had gathered along the sidewalks now. Clara Mitchell was openly crying, and Ed Patterson was blowing his nose into a handkerchief and pretending it was the cold. I cannot accept this, Walter said. You do not get a vote, Margaret replied. It took 3 days to unload everything. The truckers stayed in Cedar Falls, sleeping in their cabs or in the spare rooms that townspeople offered, and they worked alongside Walter to transform the shop. Phil Duncan and the young driver from Nebraska, a kid named Travis Cooper who turned out to be a surprisingly skilled carpenter, handled the structural repairs. They replaced the worn-out bay doors, reinforced the roof supports, and installed the new heating system that turned the shop from an icebox into something that actually felt like an indoor space. The team drivers from Montana, whose names were George and Patricia Whitfield, organized the equipment installation. George had spent 20 years as a diesel mechanic before switching to driving, and he supervised the placement of the hydraulic lift and the diagnostic station with the precision of a man who understood exactly how a shop should flow. Patricia painted the interior walls a clean, bright white that made the space look twice its actual size. Margaret coordinated everything. She had a clipboard for the materials, a clipboard for the schedule, and a clipboard for the volunteers, and she moved between them with the focused efficiency of a woman who had spent her career managing loads, routes, and deadlines. Walter watched her work and saw something he had not seen in a long time, someone who cared as much about doing things right as he did. The other drivers contributed their own skills. A trucker named Russell Crawford rewired the entire shop, while James Sullivan, who moonlighted as a welder, fabricated new workbenches and storage racks. Walter tried to help. He was told, firmly and repeatedly, to sit down and supervise. You have done enough, Margaret told him. For once in your life, let other people do the heavy lifting. Walter sat in Dorothy's recliner and watched through the window as his shop was rebuilt around him. It was the feeling of being seen, not admired, not praised, just seen. On the second evening, Margaret brought him a cup of coffee, not from his ancient machine, from a new one that Phil Duncan had bought at the hardware store in Rawlins and installed in the waiting area with a handwritten note that said, "Donated by the drivers of I-80 because nobody should have to drink Walter's coffee ever again." Walter took a sip. It was good. He looked at the note and for the first time in 3 days, he laughed. It was a real laugh, deep and full, the kind that starts in the belly and shakes the shoulders, and it surprised him almost as much as the trucks had. Margaret sat down across from him. Can I ask you something? You have earned the right to ask me anything. Why did you never charge people, all those years, all those repairs? You must have known you were hurting yourself. Walter turned the coffee mug in his hands. Outside, Russell Crawford was running cable through the new conduit, and the sound of his drill punctuated the evening quiet. Dorothy and I came to Cedar Falls in 1980. We were 23 years old, just married, did not have a dollar between us. Our truck broke down right here, right on this exact spot. There was a mechanic here then, old fellow named Harold Bennett. He fixed our truck, would not take a penny for it. Said we looked like we needed the money more than he did. Walter paused. I asked him why he did it. He said, because somebody did it for me once, and the only way to pay it back is to pay it forward. We never left. I bought this place from Harold when he retired in '81, and I have been paying it forward ever since. For 43 years. Dorothy kept me honest. She would look at the ledger every month and shake her head at all the unpaid invoices, but she never once told me to stop. She just said, "Make sure you keep enough for us, Walter." And I always did. His voice softened. Until I did not. Margaret was quiet for a moment, then she reached into her jacket and pulled out an envelope. The fund is not the only thing that happened while we were organizing this. Walter took the envelope. Inside was a letter from the Fremont County Tax Assessor's office. He read it twice because the first time through his eyes were too blurred to make sense of the words. The letter informed Walter Brennan that an anonymous benefactor had paid his property taxes in full for the current year and the following 5 years. The total payment was $38,400. The letter thanked Mr. E. Brennan for his decades of service to the Cedar Falls community and noted that the assessor's office had received numerous letters from residents and former visitors attesting to his character. Walter set the letter down on the desk. He pressed both palms flat against the surface, the way a man does when he needs to feel something solid beneath him. He closed his eyes. The drill outside stopped. The wind had died down, and in the silence, Walter Brennan heard something he had not heard in 11 years. Not with his ears, but with the part of himself that had never stopped listening for it. Dorothy's voice, not as a hallucination or a fantasy. As a memory so vivid it felt present. Her voice on summer evenings when they watched the sun go down behind the mountains. "You did good, Walter. You did enough." He opened his eyes. Margaret was still sitting across from him, watching with the patient stillness of someone who understood that some moments needed space. "Are you all right?" she asked. Walter nodded. He picked up the coffee mug, took another sip, and looked out the window at his shop. Rebuilt, renewed, filled with the sound of people working together, the new sign waiting in the parking lot to be mounted above the bay doors. A sign that carried Dorothy's name into the future. "I am now," he said. The next morning, the drivers mounted the new sign. Phil Duncan operated the lift. Travis Cooper drilled the bolts. Margaret Holloway directed the alignment, and Walter Brennan stood in the parking lot of Brennan's Auto and Diesel, surrounded by 15 truckers and half the population of Cedar Falls, and watched as his wife's name went up in letters that would not crack or fade. The truckers left that afternoon, one by one, their empty trailers riding light, their air horns sounding as they merged back onto I-80. Margaret Holloway was, once again, the last to leave. She stood by her Freightliner, hands in her jacket pockets, looking at Walter the way she had looked at him 3 weeks ago on the day the storm broke, with an expression that said she understood exactly what kind of man he was. "I will be back through in February," she said, "hauling lumber to Salt Lake City. I will stop in." "The coffee will be better this time," Walter said. Margaret smiled. It could not possibly be worse. She climbed into her cab. The engine turned over with a clean, powerful rumble. She pulled out of the lot, and Walter watched her go. Then he walked back into his shop, warm now, bright, filled with equipment he had never dreamed of owning, and he did what he had done every morning for 43 years. He poured himself a cup of coffee. He opened the bay doors, and he waited for whoever might need his help next. Outside, the Wyoming wind blew cold and steady across the mountains. The new sign caught the morning light, and somewhere on I-80, heading west, Margaret Holloway looked in her side mirror at the small town disappearing behind her and made a quiet promise to herself. She would settle up next time she came through.